Okay, before we introduce our guest, I just want to add a couple of things. One, thank you, Mark, for all the work that you've done here. And Jim, just I want to say congratulations. I know it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, but we're very, very grateful that you've stepped up to the plate and that this has happened. And we're looking forward to doing what we can to be as supportive as we can. And when I say this, to Jim's point, you know, the mission really at DFA is about leadership development. Whether you're running for office, whether you're working on a campaign, or you're leading advocacy for an issue, our job is to try to make this easier, make it more efficient, make it more fun, and try to get more people to do it. And I just hope that nobody in this room underestimates the footprint that you have created for both yourselves and for progressive politics, not only in this state, but some places where I go, out of state. And it's really remarkable. And it's all really a testament to hard work, because it is hard work to do this, and it's not easy. But believe me, I hear stuff around here and there. I travel a lot pretty much every weekend. And you guys have done really, really nice work. And I'm just really grateful that it's continuing. And the fact that you've managed to keep this as organized as it is for 2 years and to really make progressive politics, institutionalized progressive politics, and leadership development is really a testament to a lot of hard work from people in the room. So thank you very, very much for that. And thank you, Jim, for being here for this. And thanks all to everybody here in this room. You know, in December of, I think it was January of last year, I got a call from a guy that had actually had a fundraiser for Howard in Connecticut about 15 years ago, who I knew. And he called me up and he said, I'm thinking of running for office. And I said, great. And he says, I think I'm running for, I'm thinking of running for Senate against Joe Lieberman in Connecticut. And, at that point I was like, hey, that's really great. But I knew Ned, and I didn't really know what this was going to be around. And I sat down in his office, and I saw a part of Ned that I'd never really seen before. I just had known him socially. I knew he had been active in Democratic Party politics in Connecticut, but he was a guy that was so passionate about the values of this party, about the war in Iraq, about being an opposition party to some of the excesses of the current Bush administration, and about stepping up to the plate. And I was like, God, I've never seen him do this kind of stuff. Ned, this is really great, and you ought to run. And I'm not going to go through the whole campaign. The only story I wanted to share on this is, well, fast forward to primary night on August 8th, when Ned did win the primary against Joe Lieberman. In this hotel, and every time I shook hands with someone, they said, yeah, we were there with Ned right at the beginning. We had a conversation with him personally and talked him into running. So I realized that this was a guy that was not only passionate about running, but he also damn well did his homework. He must have talked to probably about 200 people, getting their advice, getting their opinions. He also decided that he was going to get some investors in this, and went out and got 10,000 people to contribute to his campaign by, I think, the spring of 2006. Before half of Connecticut even knew who Ned Lamont was. And he organized it well, and he worked his butt off, and his wife, Annie Lamont, and his entire family worked their butt off, and they won, by God, the primary, but they did a little bit more than that. They changed the complexion of what the 2006 elections across this country were going to be about. And they brought the war to its proper focus, which is front and center, and really forced a lot of the other candidates, including quite a few Democrats, to face this issue and not run away from it. And I think that was very much a defining moment in the 2006 election. And it all came from a person who had run for office once, back in 1986, something like that, and had never held public office, but had the courage. I was going to say something about it. Look, the guy had the guts to step up to the plate and do it. And there was enough people around, including DFA and a couple of other groups, that were willing to help him do it. And it's just a story, it's an incredible story about how all of us in this room can make a difference if we really want to dedicate ourselves to it. And I think really the two words, Ned, I have for you is just thank you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for what you did. Thank you for changing Connecticut politics, and especially this country's politics. So with that, please give a warm welcome to our guest of honor.
Jim's being a little modest. Actually, when I was thinking that somebody ought to challenge Joe Lieberman, I did talk to a few of my friends, and Jim Dean was one of the first people that I talked to. And the general response I got was, are you crazy? You're going up against a three-term incumbent. He's been running for public office ever since you were his entire adult life. A lot of Democrats think he was elected a Vice President of the United States of America, and you're the former third selectman of Greenwich. You thought about maybe starting off for second selectman, and you sort of move your way up from there. But I'll tell you, the reason I'm here, and Jim and Mark and everybody involved with DFA, is I wouldn't have stood a chance if it wasn't for a grassroots organization, if it wasn't for Democracy for America, and Move On, and a lot of the other groups that gave us at least an opportunity to have our voice heard early on. And I do think it was important, and I'd like to encourage each and every one of you, when your buddy comes up to you and says, look, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore, and I'm thinking about running, say, what can I do to help? And you can, just amazing what you can do if you try. Yeah, I had a pretty nice, normal, private existence. I hadn't done much in politics, but somewhere, if you turn the clock back, you know, a year and a half, 2 years ago, there were just a few items on the agenda that just made me think that country was headed in the wrong direction, and George Bush was wrong for this country, and Joe Lieberman was wrong. And if you turn the clock back, the first one that you may remember was the Terry Schiavo case. I just couldn't believe that George Bush couldn't leave Crawford, Texas, when those poor folks were standing on the rooftops in New Orleans after Katrina, and yet he flies back from Crawford in the middle of the night to Washington, D.C. to sign a bill that's going to have the federal government intrude into our private lives, intrude into our hospital room, intrude into one of the most private and personal decisions that families across the country have to make all too often. And Andy and I, my wife, were watching Meet the Press one day, probably, you know, and there was Tim Russert asking Joe Lieberman, what do you think about the federal government stepping in at a time like this? And Joe said, well, it's a question of life and death, and I want the federal government to weigh in on moments like that. I would say not at all. That's the last place I want my federal government going. I just think we have a federal government that's intruding into our private lives in ways that our founding fathers never expected. You know, from there we had the veto of funding for stem cell research, and then we had the illegal wiretaps, and just increasingly I think we have to have some people that stand up and say, stop. I was down in El Salvador, of all places, last week. It's not exactly a place I recommend if you're looking for, you know, a big college spring vacation break, but I went down there because a friend of mine was